September 20th, 1944, Brest Harbor, Brittany, France. The survey officer stepped onto the quay and stopped walking. The harbor stretched before him, and what he saw made no immediate sense, not in the way that destruction usually made sense, with a clear cause and visible crater, a logic to the violence. This was different. This was designed. Someone thought this through, he told himself, and he meant it as a compliment. Across 2 square miles of the finest deep-water anchorage on the French Atlantic coast, a harbor that had once sheltered the German battle fleet, that had once dreamed of sheltering the Allied invasion armada, there was nothing but wreckage. Not random wreckage, not the chaos of battle. The harbor of Brest had been transformed into a precision instrument of denial. At the harbor mouth, the rusted superstructure of a scuttled freighter jutted from the water at a 45-degree angle, its hull resting on the channel floor in exactly the place a supply ship would need to navigate. Behind it, the skeletal remains of a second vessel crossed the first at its midsection, the two forming a deliberate steel X across the approach. Farther in, the quay walls themselves had been demolished at regular intervals, not shattered by bombing, but blown by engineers who understood which sections, if removed, would make reconstruction most expensive. Cranes lay toppled into the basins. Fuel infrastructure had been drained and then fired. The massive U-boat pens, those cathedral-like concrete structures, stood intact because they were too thick to destroy, but every access channel to the submarine basins had been choked with sunken steel. He had worked harbor demolition surveys at Cherbourg in July. He thought he had seen what German engineers could do when they put their minds to systematic destruction. He had not seen anything. They gave themselves months, he thought. They had a plan and months to execute it, and someone with a real engineering mind was in charge. He was right on both counts. General Hermann Bernhard Ramke, the paratroop commander who had held Brest against 75,000 American soldiers for nearly 6 weeks, had signed his surrender the day before, September 19, 1944. But before he walked out to give up, before he fired the ceremonial last artillery shell that he had reserved for the occasion, his engineers had gone to work on the harbor. They had gone to work weeks before the surrender, in fact, methodically dismantling every piece of infrastructure that might allow an Allied supply ship to dock. They had worked according to a plan that Ramke believed would strangle the Allied advance in northern France for the better part of a year. Standing on the rubble-strewn quay, surveying a harbor that looked like the fever dream of a demolition engineer, ships arranged to block, quays collapsed to obstruct, channels sown with mines to kill, the survey officer pulled out his notebook. He had a job to do. The question was whether it was actually possible. What the Allied commanders understood about this seemingly impossible situation would surprise everyone. If you're enjoying this story, hit like to help us bring more of these forgotten heroes to light. Subscribe for more. Now, back to that moment in Paris. 45 miles to the east, in Paris, Allied commanders were already asking the same question and coming to a conclusion that would have surprised Ramke enormously. The journey to that wrecked harbor had begun not in Brest, but across an ocean and 3 years earlier, in the burned-out cavities of Pearl Harbor, in the muddy shallows of Massawa, in the oil-slicked waters of Casablanca, and on the blood-red sands of Normandy. It was the story of how America learned, through catastrophe after catastrophe, to undo what its enemies had done to the water. Before December 7, 1941, the United States Navy had almost no systematic salvage capability. Individual officers had mastered the discipline, men like Commander Edward Ellsberg, who had raised the submarine S-51 from the seafloor in 1926 and who spent the interwar years writing books about the arcane science of lifting things from the bottom. But there was no organization, no dedicated fleet, no doctrine for what to do when a harbor full of ships had been sunk or wrecked. Pearl Harbor changed that, with the particular ferocity of lessons that cost lives to teach. On December 8, 1941, the morning after, a Navy civil engineer named William Aloysius Sullivan reported for duty in Washington. Sullivan was not a combat officer. He had graduated from MIT in 1917 with a degree in architectural engineering, had entered the Navy during the Great War, and had spent the intervening decades doing salvage work that his colleagues considered unglamorous, retrieving grounded gunboats in Mexico, lifting capsized ferries, working the waterfront jobs that other officers preferred not to notice. He had spent the months before Pearl Harbor in London, quietly watching how the Royal Navy managed its own wreck-clearing operations in bomb-damaged British harbors, filing reports that almost no one read. When Pearl Harbor happened, someone remembered those reports. Within days, Sullivan was appointed the United States Navy's first supervisor of salvage, a position that had to be invented for him because nothing like it had existed before. His first major test came not in the Pacific, but in New York Harbor, where the French ocean liner Normandy, requisitioned as a troop transport and renamed USS Lafayette, caught fire and capsized at her pier in February 1942. The ship was on her side, blocking one of the busiest berths in the harbor, and the conventional wisdom among professional salvors was that lifting her was not feasible. Sullivan spent 14 months doing what his critics said could not be done, pumping the ship upright through a combination of cofferdams, compressed air, and the systematic removal of 7,000 tons of salvaged equipment. The New York Times, no stranger to hyperbole, called it the hardest salvage job in history. Sullivan called it a training exercise, because the real tests were waiting in North Africa. When Allied forces invaded Morocco and Algeria in November 1942 under Operation Torch, the Vichy French defenders scuttled ships in the harbors rather than surrender them intact. At Oran, the port Eisenhower needed to sustain his campaign, 14 vessels had been sunk in positions chosen to block the main channels. Sullivan's salvage teams arrived with floating cranes, underwater cutting torches, and methods adapted from the Normandy job, and began work. At Bizerte in Tunisia, where German and Italian engineers had sunk dozens of vessels in an attempt to deny the Allies a Mediterranean supply base, the same teams worked around the clock in waters still being contested by enemy aircraft, lifting hulks and blasting obstructions to clear channels one by one. These were not incidental sideshows. The mathematics of the Allied offensive in North Africa were stark. An armored division consumed approximately 350 tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies per day. 3 such divisions, the minimum force Eisenhower needed to advance, required a dedicated port to function. Without a working harbor, the offensive stalled. With one, it could proceed. Sullivan's men learned, harbor by harbor, that the difference between a wrecked port and a working one was measured in tons of steel moved per day, and that tons of steel moved per day was a function of how many cranes you had, how many trained divers, and how systematically you approached the problem. The method that emerged from North Africa was built on 2 technical innovations that distinguished it from traditional salvage work. The first was the use of pontoons, prefabricated air chambers that could be attached to a sunken hull and inflated to provide supplemental buoyancy, allowing vessels too large to lift by crane to be floated with controlled precision. The second was the adaptation of oxyacetylene and oxyhydrogen cutting torches for underwater use, allowing salvage teams to section a sunken vessel, cutting it into manageable pieces rather than attempting to raise it whole. Together, these techniques let a skilled team approach a harbor obstruction with genuine options: lift it, section it, or use explosives to break it apart and remove the pieces. German engineers designing harbor demolitions in 1943 and 1944 were largely accounting for the first option. The flexibility provided by the second and third was something they consistently underestimated. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the U.S. Navy supervisor of salvage had built something that had not existed 3 years before: a genuine doctrine, a trained corps of men, and a set of tools that had been tested in the hardest possible conditions. Sullivan himself was aboard the flagship USS Augusta on June 6th, alongside General Omar Bradley, watching the landing craft fight toward Omaha Beach. His teams were there in the surf, pulling wrecked craft off the beach, keeping the approach lanes open, making sure the greatest amphibious operation in history did not strangle itself on its own wreckage. Then came the ports. Cherbourg fell to American forces on June 27, 1944. The Germans there had destroyed the harbor with the same systematic thoroughness that would later characterize Brest: sunken ships, blown cranes, mined channels. Sullivan's teams moved in on July 1st and worked the harbor without pause. By July 16th, enough of the channel had been cleared that 4 Liberty ships could anchor in the outer roads. 3 days later, Cherbourg began discharging cargo. The harbor that German engineers had expected to keep closed for months was partially open in 19 days. That number, 19 days, traveled up the Allied command chain and lodged in the calculations of staff officers who were trying to understand what was now possible. It also presumably reached German intelligence. It was the number Römke's engineers had to beat at Brest. What made 19 days remarkable was not just the speed, it was what the speed revealed about the system Sullivan had built. At Cherbourg, his teams had not improvised their way through the problem. They had arrived with pre-planned lifting sequences, pre-assigned diving teams for each obstruction, and pre-positioned equipment staged at the harbor entrance before the city had even fallen. The doctrine was not developed in response to the wreckage, it was ready before the wreckage was surveyed. That meant the 19 days included the learning curve, it included the unexpected, it included the improvisation that every salvage operation demands, no matter how well planned. Strip those factors out, and Sullivan's men had in fact moved faster than the raw timeline suggested. They had cleared Cherbourg in 19 days while still treating it as a training problem. The harbor at Brest, when they arrived, would be the final exam, and they had spent 3 years preparing for it. The strategic picture in the summer of 1944 was defined almost entirely by supply, and the supply situation was defined almost entirely by ports. When Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines near St. Lo on July 25th in the exploitation of Operation Cobra, it unleashed a kind of military motion that supply planners had not fully anticipated. Armored divisions do not advance on a leisurely schedule. They advance as fast as their fuel allows, and then they stop. Patton's tanks were burning through 400,000 gallons of gasoline per day at the peak of the pursuit. Behind him, the Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy that ran day and night along dedicated one-way roads from the Normandy beaches, was moving 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its maximum, which was still not enough. The problem was simple and structural. Allied planners had assumed that Cherbourg would be fully operational by D+30, and that Brest, with its magnificent deep-water harbor, its multiple basins, its established rail connections running east, would be open and receiving major convoy traffic by D+60. Allied divisions required 26,000 tons of daily supply by September 1944 to sustain their offensive. The Normandy beaches and Cherbourg together could not get close to that figure. Brest was supposed to supply the difference. Römke knew this. He had been told it explicitly when Hitler declared Brest a fortress. The Führer's decision was not primarily about the city itself, which had been bombed nearly to rubble in any case. It was about the harbor. Holding the harbor, or if it could not be held, destroying it so thoroughly that the Allies could not use it, was Römke's primary strategic mission. Hitler had watched Cherbourg fall in June and had been privately horrified by how quickly Sullivan's teams opened it. He was not going to allow the same at the best deep-water port on the Breton coast. His engineers had been working toward the destruction plan since August. While American infantry fought their way through fortified strongpoints, reducing approximately 75 prepared positions across weeks of grinding urban combat, German harbor engineers were making their own calculations. Which ships should go where to achieve maximum channel obstruction? Which quay sections, if demolished at their load-bearing points, would be most expensive to reconstruct? Where should mines be placed in the approach channels to turn the salvage work from dangerous to suicidal? The answers to those questions were implemented systematically. Vessels were flooded in their berths in positions that had been surveyed for maximum disruption. Bridge debris was dropped into the Penfeld River, the body of water that had historically sheltered France's Atlantic fleet, to block navigation. The floating cranes that a harbor needs to function were toppled into the basins they served. Fuel tanks were drained and ignited. By the time American forces entered the harbor area in late September, they found not a wrecked port, but an argument. The argument that modern naval engineering, applied by smart people with enough time, could create a problem that would take other smart people significantly longer to solve. What Romke believed, what he told his superiors before the surrender, was that his engineers had bought Germany 6 months of time. The Allies would not receive significant supply tonnage through Brest before the spring of 1945. The front would freeze, the German lines would stabilize, the chance for a German strategic recovery would present itself. It was a reasonable assessment, based on what German intelligence knew about Allied salvage capabilities. German intelligence had not fully updated its files since Cherbourg. And there was a second miscalculation embedded in Romke's plan, one that had nothing to do with salvage timelines. It was a geographic assumption, baked so deeply into German strategic thinking that it had never been examined. The assumption was that the Allies, once they broke out of Normandy, would advance in a measured arc that kept Brest relevant as a supply anchor throughout the autumn campaign. German planners had wargamed multiple Allied advance scenarios. In each of them, Brest remained within reasonable supply distance of the front for at least 6 to 8 months. None of the scenarios accounted for the possibility that Patton's Third Army would move so fast, so far, and so relentlessly that the entire Breton Peninsula would become a strategic backwater within weeks of the city's fall. Romke's harbor demolition was a masterpiece of engineering directed at a strategic problem that would cease to exist before the work could take effect. He had built the perfect lock. He had simply failed to account for the possibility that the Allies would stop needing the door. The survey teams that entered Brest Harbor in late September 1944 found conditions that were, by any technical measure, severe. The main approach channel was blocked in multiple places by scuttled ships. Several large vessels had been sunk crosswise to the channel axis, creating overlapping obstructions that could not be addressed by simply removing one at a time. The quay walls had been demolished at their structural bases, leaving overhanging sections that were unstable and potentially lethal to work near. Every basin had been seeded with some combination of contact mines, delayed action explosives, and booby traps. Visibility in the harbor water, already poor in the autumn conditions of the Breton coast, was made worse by the silt kicked up by the demolition charges. A diver entering the main channel to place a survey instrument was working effectively blind. The key question for Allied command was not whether the harbor could be cleared. Sullivan's men had cleared harder harbors, but whether it was worth clearing and on what timeline. And that question, as the survey results came in through October, took on a different character than anyone had expected. The front had moved. In the 6 weeks since Romke's surrender, Patton's Third Army had advanced nearly 400 miles. Paris had been liberated on August 25th, while the Battle of Brest was still going on. The Allied front line was now near the Belgian-German border. The ports that mattered were no longer on the Breton Peninsula. Antwerp, seized largely intact by British forces on September 4, 1944, in a feat of opportunistic speed that prevented the Germans from demolishing it, was becoming the critical node. Antwerp lay 200 miles closer to the front than Brest. A Liberty ship discharging at Antwerp could put its cargo on a truck that reached the front in hours. A Liberty ship at Brest faced a road journey of 600 miles over French infrastructure that had been bombed, shelled, and worn out by 9 months of logistics traffic. On September 14th, General John Lee, commanding the communications zone that managed Allied supply, summarized the situation for Eisenhower. Extensive development of Brest was no longer sound. The port was too far from the fighting to serve the advancing front. The engineering effort required to rehabilitate it would be better directed elsewhere. This was the conclusion that Romke had never anticipated. He had built his entire strategic argument on the assumption that Brest was irreplaceable, that the Allies needed it specifically, and that denying it to them would be decisive. He was operating on the logistics assumptions of June 1944. By October, those assumptions were months out of date. But something else was happening simultaneously, something that the strategic calculus did not capture. The men who had been sent to survey the harbor, who had descended on lines into the Black Channel water, who had laid survey instruments across the hulls of scuttled ships, who had mapped every obstruction and every mine position, had learned something in Brest that they had not learned at Cherbourg or Casablanca or anywhere else. They had encountered for the first time a harbor demolition plan of genuine sophistication. The German engineers at Brest had not simply sunk ships, they had studied the Allied salvage methods from earlier operations and designed obstructions specifically intended to defeat them. At Cherbourg, the simplest approach to removing a sunken ship was to pump it partially buoyant, attach lifting cables, and haul it clear. At Brest, the scuttled vessels had been modified before sinking, seacocks opened in multiple compartments, bulkheads damaged in ways that would make controlled reflooding difficult, hulls resting in orientations that complicated cable attachment. The approach channels had been mined with magnetic influence devices that would activate in response to the large metallic mass of a floating crane working overhead, a deliberate counter to the most common piece of Allied salvage equipment. Allied survey officers, in their reports, described the Brest obstacles as showing evidence of planning against salvage operations specifically, a phrase that was technically understated and that senior engineers found alarming. Sullivan's teams, when they arrived in force in October, adapted. Where direct lifting was compromised, they used explosives more aggressively to break obstruction vessels into sections small enough to move piecemeal. Where magnetic mines blocked crane access, minesweepers worked ahead of every salvage evolution, sweeping channels section by section before cranes were positioned. Where zero-visibility diving made direct survey impossible, engineers developed new techniques using sound-ranging equipment to map the bottom without putting men into water they could not see. The work proceeded. Not quickly. The complexity was genuine, and the weather of the Breton autumn was not cooperative, but it proceeded. By November, a navigable channel had been cut through the outer approaches. By December, portions of the inner harbor were accessible. The engineering knowledge being accumulated at Brest, lessons about how to defeat sophisticated harbor demolition, would prove worth more than the port itself, because Antwerp opened in late November 1944, and the Brest problem, from a logistics perspective, was solved by the one thing German planners had not modeled: the Allied advance outrunning the geographic assumptions on which the destruction plan had been based. But the men still in the water at Brest did not know that yet, not in the way that changes how you work. They knew Antwerp was opening. They knew the front had moved. They also knew that the obstructions beneath them were real, that the mines were real, and that the job in front of them was the job in front of them regardless of what was happening 600 miles to the east. There is a particular discipline required to do careful, dangerous, technically demanding work when the strategic rationale for that work is dissolving around you, when every morning briefing makes it a little clearer that what you are doing is less urgent than it was the day before, and yet the consequences of a mistake remain exactly as permanent. The harbor teams at Brest maintained that discipline. They worked the problem they had been given with the same methodical precision they would have brought to a harbor that was feeding the entire Allied advance. That professionalism, more than any single technical achievement, was what Sullivan had actually built over 3 years. To understand what happened at Brest, and what it meant, not just for the harbor but for the war, you have to understand what Commodore William Sullivan had built in 3 years and what he was building with it. Sullivan's vision, from the day he became supervisor of salvage in December 1941, was not simply to clear individual harbors. It was to create an industrial system for undoing industrial destruction. His adversaries, the German and Italian engineers who had wrecked Oran, Bizerte, Cherbourg, and now Brest, were themselves products of a coherent doctrine. German military engineering manuals for harbor demolition existed. The Wehrmacht trained engineers specifically for this work. The destruction at Brest was not improvised, it was implemented from a playbook. Sullivan's answer was a counter-playbook built on three principles. The first was that salvage operations had to be industrialized. Single heroes solving single problems was not adequate to the scale of the war. What was needed was a production line approach to wreck clearance, standardized tools, trained crews who could be deployed anywhere on short notice, protocols that could be handed from one team to another. The Navy diving school that Sullivan had established alongside the Normandy wreck in New York was the seed crystal of this system, a factory for producing men who knew how to work underwater in difficult conditions. By 1944, that school had trained hundreds of divers and salvage specialists, and Sullivan could deploy qualified teams to a new harbor within days of its capture. The second principle was equipment density. German harbor demolitions worked on the assumption that the Allies had limited heavy lift capacity, that without enough cranes and enough pontoon capacity, obstructions could not be removed at the rate necessary to open a harbor before the strategic situation changed. Sullivan had spent 2 years arguing with naval procurement to build salvage vessels specifically designed for harbor clearance, heavy lift pontoon barges, floating cranes capable of handling hundreds of tons, specialized cutting equipment for working below the waterline. By the Normandy invasion, his pre-positioned salvage fleet was the largest dedicated harbor clearance force any military had ever assembled. The third principle, the one that distinguished Sullivan's approach from everything that came before, was that salvage and demolition were the same discipline, deployed in opposite directions. You could not understand how to clear a harbor without understanding exactly how it had been wrecked. You could not devise efficient lifting solutions without first mapping precisely the geometry of what had been sunk and why. The survey work that preceded every major clearance operation was not a preliminary, it was the operation. Every hour spent measuring the Brest obstructions from the water surface, every dive into the channel to place a survey rod, every explosion test conducted to determine the composition of a sunken hull was converting German engineering knowledge into American engineering advantage. This is the principle that the strategic decision not to fully develop Brest obscures if you focus only on the port's limited operational use. The knowledge gained at Brest was deployed immediately and elsewhere. The same teams, the same methods, and the lessons specifically learned from defeating sophisticated German demolition design were used at Le Havre, which opened October 9, 1944, at Antwerp, where the Germans had been denied the opportunity to execute their demolition plan, but where mines and obstructions still blocked the Scheldt River approaches. Sullivan's teams cleared the navigable channel that made the port operational by late November. The supply crisis that had been threatening to freeze the Allied advance, the crisis that Ramke's harbor demolition was specifically designed to deepen, was resolved by men and methods that Ramke himself had helped train at Brest. Logistics is not an abstraction. Logistics is the answer to the question, how many trucks can you load and how fast and from how many ships and where does it go when it leaves the dock? The Allied answer to that question by the winter of 1944 was Antwerp, 26,000 tons of daily capacity, the number that supply planners had been chasing since June. Getting to that answer required Cherbourg, Brest, Le Havre, and 100 smaller clearance operations that most histories never mention. It required men who had learned, harbor by harbor, how to undo what their enemies had done. The cost of Brest was measured in multiple currencies. The battle to capture it, the 44-day siege that began on August 7, 1944, and ended with Ramke's surrender on September 19, consumed 75,000 American soldiers, produced nearly 10,000 casualties, and expended ammunition at a rate that general officers later identified as one of the contributing factors to the supply crisis of September and October. Every shell fired at the forts of Brest was a shell not available to the divisions pushing toward Germany. The city itself was reduced to rubble. Medieval fortifications and German concrete survived, but the inhabited streets did not. French civilians who had been forcibly evacuated before the siege returned to find their homes gone. For the harbor workers who entered in September, the cost was different. It was measured in proximity to things that wanted to kill them. The mine threat in Brest Harbor was not theoretical. German engineers had seeded the basins and channels with multiple types of devices, including magnetic influence mines that conventional minesweeping methods could not neutralize, and that posed a specific danger to salvage vessels operating overhead. The diving teams descending into the main channel were aware that their equipment, the metal fittings of their apparatus, the cables they dragged behind them, could trigger devices they could not see. Work stoppages for dedicated minesweeping were scheduled around every lifting evolution. They were not always sufficient. Sources from the period record incidents in which demolition charges set weeks earlier and designed with delayed fuses detonated near work parties without warning. The harbor divers worked in water with essentially no visibility. Autumn rains had stirred the silt from the channel bottom, and the demolition of the quay walls had added pulverized concrete to the suspension. A diver entering the main channel could extend his arm and lose sight of his own glove. Navigation below the surface was done by feel, by dragging survey cables along the bottom, by counting kicks to estimate distance, by pressing hands against the cold steel of a sunken hull and following it by touch to find the points where charges needed to be placed. Every dive was a calculation. How much air remained in the tanks, how deep the obstruction lay, how far the nearest surface rescue could reach if something went wrong in the dark. For the engineers working above, operating the cutting torches that sliced through sunken hulls, running the pontoon cranes that lifted sections of wreck clear of the channel, the challenge was different but no less constant. The October and November weather on the Breton coast produced sea states that made precision crane work nearly impossible, swinging loads that weighed hundreds of tons into unpredictable arcs. Floating equipment was difficult to hold in position. Work schedules built around tidal windows required round-the-clock shifts that exhausted crews to the edge of judgment. And through all of it, the strategic clock was running in the wrong direction. Every week that passed without Brest open was a week in which Antwerp's importance grew and Brest's shrank. The men doing the work understood this. They were not clearing the harbor because it had become critical. They were clearing it because abandoning it entirely would have left the job undone, the knowledge unlearned, and the precedent set that sufficiently sophisticated German demolition could defeat American salvage capability. There was another dimension to the work that reports do not easily capture, the sheer physical weight of it. Harbor clearance is not elegant engineering. It is man in freezing water, cutting steel with torches that produce clouds of bubbles and steam, dragging cables through silt that hasn't been disturbed since the wreck settled. It is working 12-hour shifts in weather that turns a floating crane into a pendulum. It is planning an evolution with tidal windows and weather forecasts, and then watching both forecasts fail simultaneously. The men who cleared the harbors of France in the autumn of 1944 were, in most military histories, invisible. Their names appear in unit logs, in casualty figures, in port rehabilitation reports filed with the Army Transportation Corps. They do not appear in the popular accounts of the campaign. The battle for France is told as a story of tanks and infantry and artillery, and the harbor workers who made the tanks go are footnotes, if they appear at all. That precedent was not allowed to stand. By December 1944, the outer approaches to Brest were navigable. The deep-water channel that the German demolition plan had been designed to close for 6 months had been opened. Not in time to matter strategically. Antwerp had solved the supply crisis in November, but it had been opened. And the men who opened it carried what they learned to every port that followed. The Battle of Brest Siege, August 7th to September 19th, 1944, 44 days. U.S. forces committed, approximately 75,000 troops from 3 infantry divisions, 2nd, 8th, 29th, Rangers, Armor, and Combat Engineers. American casualties, approximately 10,000. German garrison, approximately 40,000 men under Ramke, including the 2nd Parachute Division, 266th Division, 343rd Division, and supporting units. German prisoners taken, approximately 37,000. The logistics context. Allied divisions on the continent required 26,000 tons of daily supply by September 19, 1944. Cherbourg, captured June 27, 1944. First Liberty ship entry, July 16, 1944. 19 days from capture to open channel. Antwerp opened to Allied shipping, late November 1944. Distance from Brest to the front lines, September 19, 1944, approximately 600 miles. The harbor. German demolition included scuttled vessels positioned crosswise in approach channels, quay walls demolished at structural bases, magnetic influence and contact mines throughout the basin, cranes toppled, fuel infrastructure destroyed, rail connections severed, hulls structurally modified before sinking to defeat standard lifting methods. Outer approach channel navigable, December 1944. Allied command decision, harbor deemed too distant from the advancing front for strategic development, limited rehabilitation conducted. The supply chain and legacy. Antwerp daily discharge capacity at peak approximately 26,000 long tons, the figure Allied planners had originally assigned to Brest. Sullivan's salvage doctrine applied across North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific. Sullivan's title, inscribed on his gravestone at Arlington National Cemetery, Father of Naval Salvage. The survey officer had closed his notebook on September 20, 1944, with a question he couldn't yet answer. By December, that question had been resolved, in a way that made the question itself obsolete. The harbor at Brest was cleared. It just didn't matter in the way anyone expected. What persisted was something harder to quantify than tonnage discharged. The doctrine that Sullivan built, the counter-doctrine to German harbor demolition, refined port by port from New York to the Philippines, became the foundation of what the U.S. Navy calls marine salvage in every manual written since. The specific lessons from Brest about defeating sophisticated demolition design, about maintaining operational tempo against magnetic influence mining, about working in zero visibility conditions under active mine threat, showed up in planning documents used in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War. When a harbor needed to be cleared in conditions that resembled a deliberate, intelligent obstruction rather than the incidental wreckage of battle, the officers doing the work reached for doctrine that traced its lineage to the men who had gone underwater in the dark at Brest. Ramke spent the post-war years in French custody, tried for war crimes related to his conduct during the siege. He was eventually released in 1951. In his memoir, he expressed satisfaction with the harbor demolition. He had, he wrote, deprived the Allies of the use of a great port for the decisive months of the campaign. He was not entirely wrong. Brest was not operational during those months, but the causal chain he imagined, denial of harbor leading to supply crisis, leading to strategic stall, leading to German recovery, failed at every link. The Allied advance did not stall for lack of Brest. The supply crisis was real and painful and contributed to the lengthening of the war's European phase. But it was resolved by Antwerp, by the improvised genius of the Red Ball Express, by the accumulated knowledge of harbor clearance that his own engineers had, through their excellence at demolition, helped transfer to the men who came to undo it. There is a particular quality to excellence in an adversary. It teaches you whether you want to learn or not. Ramke's engineers were excellent. They built the hardest harbor obstruction American salvors had encountered, and in the process of defeating it, those salvors became capable of defeating anything that followed. In modern warfare, the battle for logistics is frequently the battle that determines the outcome. The soldiers on the front, brilliant, brave, irreplaceable, are downstream of the trucks and ships and harbors and cranes. What flows through those systems is what they fight with, and the systems work when they work because men like Sullivan spent the whole war learning to make them work in harbors that taught painful lessons no classroom could replicate. When the first supply convoy navigated the cleared approaches to Brest in December 1944, it passed over the rusting hulks of ships that Ramke had put there to stop it. The harbor was working. The war had moved on, and the men who had learned to clear it were already somewhere else, opening the next port.